When you go to the store to buy potting mix, what is it that you're actually buying? Well, I've got 4 bags that run from relatively cheap to quite expensive that I'm going to take a look at. Join me today as I look at the differences in potting mixes. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and potting mixes are a necessary part of gardening. For most of us, when we're starting seeds and growing those seedlings, it's in a potting mix. If you grow in pots and containers, it's usually in a potting mix. And for most gardeners, particularly new gardeners, a potting mix is the first thing you grab when you look to improve the soil in your garden beds. As I look at these 4 bags in particular, I notice an interesting difference. The 2 cheaper bags, the big name bags that I got at the big box garden center, are labeled as potting mix. These other bags that I got at my local nursery that are much more expensive are labeled as potting soil. For our purposes today, potting mix and potting soil are the same. You'll notice a difference in ingredients, but how we use them in the garden is going to be identical. So let's take a look at what I have. My first bag is Stay Green potting mix with added fertilizer. This is a national brand, and you will probably see it in your store in the United States. It's recommended for container gardening, and the fertilizer, according to the company, feeds for up to 9 months. I got this 64 quart bag for $11.98, which works out to about 19 cents per quart. The next is a Miracle-Gro Moisture Control potting mix. The big selling point of this one is that it protects against over and underwatering. Because it has added fertilizers, it can feed the plants for up to 6 months. It's also recommended for indoor and outdoor container plants. This bag cost me $17.98, which works out to about 36 cents per quart. Fox Farm is a favorite premium brand of a lot of growers. This is the Happy Frog mix, and I've used this before. Potting soil contains mycorrhiza and humic acid for indoor and outdoor plants, and this bag cost me $28.99, which works out to about 56 cents per quart. And from a local Colorado company, Peonia Soil, this is the Bomb mix that I got at my local nursery. And it has a ton of different ingredients in here. We'll be going through all of this. This is a 100% cocoa husk peat base, which makes it different than the others. This bag cost $39.99, which works out to about 78 cents per quart. Now, you can obviously grow plants in all of these bags, but the most expensive one is 4 times the cost of the least expensive one. And I make my own potting mix, just using a blend of peat moss, compost, and perlite. And I'll link to that video at the end of this one so you can see how I do it. My mix is even less expensive than the cheapest bag you can buy. Keep that in mind as we look at the ingredients. My blend of peat moss, compost, and perlite, and then how it compares with the rest of these. The ingredients in the Stay Green are pretty basic. It's formulated from 1 or more of peat, processed forest products, coir, and or compost, along with sphagnum peat moss, perlite, and fertilizer. The fertilizer is derived from ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, ammonium sulfate, calcium phosphate and urea, and ammonium phosphate and potassium sulfate, which gives a reading of about 0.1% nitrogen, 0.08% phosphate, and 0.06% potash. Let's put those numbers in context. If you use a 10-10-10 fertilizer, that's 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium by weight. Well, when we look at this bag that has 0.1% of the nitrogen, that means a standard 10-10-10 fertilizer has 100 times the fertilizer that you would get in this bag. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what we actually get inside the bag. Go ahead and open the bag and then scoop out some of this material so we can take a closer look. The texture is pretty light, but remember it can have forest products in it, and forest products usually means ground up trees. So there are some chunky pieces of wood here. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but this is the kind of product you might want to sift before using with young seedlings. You can see the little white specks of perlite running through it, and occasionally you'll come across one of these little balls. These are the slow release fertilizer pellets. But as I look through this, it's not surprising since it's got such a low amount of fertilizer, I don't see a lot of those balls, but I'm coming across more chunks of wood. So keep this in mind. The cheaper product is relatively chunky, but can be used to grow plants. Now let's take a look at the Miracle-Gro potting mix. This mix is formulated from sphagnum peat moss and then one or more of processed forest products, peat, and/or compost. Then coir, perlite, and fertilizer. And they add a wetting agent. Now these ingredients vary slightly for some specific states in the United States. As to their fertilizer, it's derived from ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, calcium phosphate, potassium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, calcium phosphate, and potassium sulfate. And it has a 0.21% nitrogen, 0.11 phosphate, and 0.16 potash. About twice as much as the previous bag. I'll point out that the Miracle-Gro is the only one that identifies itself as a certified premium potting soil that conforms to the standards of the Mulch and Soil Council. Let's see how this one compares when we look inside. The consistency of this is light and fluffy and does have some chunky bits of wood. There's those forest products for you. It doesn't look much different than the Stay Green. I can see the little white bits of perlite scattered throughout. It has the same type of slow release fertilizer pellets. Now, they market this as moisture control. Sometimes you'll see polymers added that will absorb and hold water, but I don't see anything on the bag about those polymers, so I think this just might be marketing, because all of the peat that I can see in here and these little strands are the cocoa coir. The strands of the coir and the peat moss are going to hold on to a lot of moisture, making this whole mix moisture control. Now let's take a look at a truly premium mix, the Happy Frog. The Fox Farm mix is 50 to 60% aged forest products, sphagnum peat moss, perlite, and fertilizer that is derived from earthworm castings, bat guano, oyster shell, and dolomite lime. It also contains a number of different strains of mycorrhiza. The mycorrhiza adds a fungal component to this potting soil. And a number of studies have shown that a healthy soil includes not only the bacteria, but the fungi. And as that fungi grows, it sends out those little white threads you might see. Those are the mycorrhizal networks. And that enables the roots to absorb the nutrients from the soil. So it does make some sense to add it to a mix like this. They also get their fertilizers from organic materials, the earthworm castings, bat guano, and oyster shell, as opposed to the synthetic granules that were in the previous two mixes. So that's one reason why this is more expensive, because of the organics and because of the mycorrhizal. So let's see what's inside. This is also a nice light, fluffy mix. You may have noted that the ingredients are essentially the same: forest products, peat moss, and perlite. And there looks to be a lot more perlite in this mix. There's still the chunky wood pieces, but this being aged forest products, that tells me that they were probably composting it. So they break apart pretty easily. And they're not quite as fresh and chunky as the previous two. It's a darker color, but as for the texture, there really isn't much difference from what we saw in the previous ones. Now let's take a look at the balm from Peonia Soil Company. Now, this is a regional company, so chances are if you don't live in Colorado, you might not be able to find this. You probably have a regional distributor of potting soils like this. You're not going to find them in the big box stores. You're going to have to go to your local nursery and ask for a product like this. This has a long list of ingredients, starting with the coconut husk peat, just another name for cocoa coir, perlite, dynamic dressing compost, worm castings, kelp meal, feather meal, gypsum, oyster shell flour, dolomite lime, dried molasses, azomite, fishbone meal, seabird guano, humate, mastodon peat, mycorrhizal inoculant, and I looked online, they use 12 different inoculants, green sand, citric acid, manganese sulfate, zinc sulfate, sodium borate, and natural potash. Again, they're not using synthetic ingredients like the Fox Farm, and this appears to be all organic potting soil. This is noticeably lighter and fluffier. It doesn't have forest products, so there are no chunks of any type. There are some pieces of the coconut fibers, so you can see that pretty readily. A lot more perlite in this mix. The coconut fiber is going to absorb a lot of water. The perlite's going to add a lot of drainage. It's a darker color. Obviously no synthetic fertilizer pellets in here. A substantially noticeable difference from the previous two mixes. So what does all of this mean to you as you choose your potting mix or potting soil? Well, it depends on your budget, and it depends on how you plan to use these products. You saw that the primary ingredients tend to be sphagnum peat moss, forest products, and perlite in the lower end and the higher end bags. The most expensive bags tends to be coir based, because at least in the United States, cocoa coir is more expensive than sphagnum peat moss. And as you add more ingredients to the bags, they get more expensive. But do you really need all of those ingredients? Well, if you're growing in a big pot, a container that this is going to be the primary medium, it makes sense to have a lot of these organic additives. They're going to break down over time and give the plants the nutrients that they need. The products with the synthetic fertilizers, that's only going to last 6 to 9 months. But for the organic fertilizers to work, you need the development of the microbes and the mycorrhiza. If you're just potting up seedlings for a couple months and then sticking them into the garden, that's not enough time for these organic fertilizers to break down and for the fungal network to become fully established. So you might be wasting some money if this is just a short-term medium for your plants. It might make more sense to use the cheaper products. It's not going to hurt anything to have all of this extra stuff added to your potting mix or potting soil. So if you can afford these premium mixes, go ahead and get the premium mixes. But for seed starting and then transplanting on a budget, go ahead and get the cheaper products. That's a good way to save money and get the same results. The choice is yours. I tend to go low end. This year, I'll be experimenting a little bit more with these high-end products, and I'll let you know how that goes. To see how I make my most cost-effective mix, go ahead and check out this video now. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.